Okay, brilliant. So a formal welcome to this afternoon's Muscular Dystrophy UK Muscles Matter 2021 online seminar on Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is coming, of course, in the week of World Duchenne Awareness Day. So building on the success of our 2020 series, we've now built the Muscle Matters seminars into being a regular feature in our calendar. And hopefully next year we'll be able to come back with live events as well, but we'll certainly be continuing with these virtual events. We're running 2 or 3 seminars a month, and they focus on a range of general and condition specific topics. And they include sessions that you've told us that you found most valuable, so on things like research, practical and financial support, and on managing different conditions. And each seminar has ample opportunity for questions and answers with our panel. Really key to note that our helpline remains available to anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions, and do please contact us if you have any questions or are in need of support. We can help you with information and can either support you directly or point you to where you can get support. And the number and email address should be on the screen shortly, and we're available on 0800 652 6352, or you can email info@musculardystrophyuk.org. We're hugely grateful to be joined by an expert panel that cover a broad range of expertise on Duchenne muscular dystrophy today. And we're also very grateful for the support of our sponsors this afternoon, PTC Therapeutics and Roche. We're splitting the session into 3 parts, and we'll begin by looking at research. Then we'll move to a session on standards of care for adults, and then we'll finish off by exploring living with and managing Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So before we begin, a quick note on how you can ask questions or make comments throughout the session. So we've had some advanced questions, and we'll seek to cover these as we go through the next couple of hours. But we'd also really like to incorporate some of your live input. And to do that, we'll be using the Q&A function. So please type your question or comment using the Q&A function you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. And Kate or myself will feed these into this discussion as we go. To help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on questioners to ask their questions directly. Any questions we don't manage to cover or that we can't answer, we'll seek to answer through our website afterwards. And finally, a reminder that we're recording the session, and it will be made available over the next few days again through our website. So to start us off this afternoon, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Kate Adcock, our Director of Research and Innovation, who will introduce our research speakers and then chair that part of this afternoon session. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce 2 fantastic speakers to this afternoon's session. First of all, we'll be hearing from Dr. Jared Wong, who is a consultant paediatric endocrinologist at the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow, where he's also a clinical senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. Jared did his undergraduate degree in Australia and then moved to Glasgow to carry out his clinical training. And his clinical and translational research interests focus on the growth of skeletal muscle or skeletal development in childhood chronic conditions. And he's a particular expert in bone health in boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You'll be hearing a bit more about that in a short while. Our other speaker this afternoon is Professor Francesco Montoni, who is a paediatric neurologist who also trained overseas in Italy, has worked in the UK in London since the early 1990s. First, he was at the Hammersmith, which is now part of Imperial College, and now he's at UCL, where he's the director of the Dybowitz Neuromuscular Centre at the UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health. He's also an honorary consultant at Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. Francesco is chief investigator on many studies, including natural history studies, clinical trials, and other research projects across a range of paediatric neuromuscular conditions. And we'll be hearing from him in a moment. So first of all, Jared, I'd like to hand over to you to talk to us about bone health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate and MDUK, for the opportunity to share with you some of the research that the research group in Glasgow have performed in particular aspects of research on steroid side effects in DMD. Next slide, please. So we're very grateful for the co-funding of MDUK, Action Duchenne, and the CSO, the Chief Scientist Office Scotland, who've co-funded Dr. Shuko Joseph as a clinical academic fellow from 2016 to 2019, working as a PhD student supervised by myself. And over the last 5 years, based on the work that Dr. Joseph have been involved with, we've been able to add to the scientific literature in the aspects of endocrine and bone complications in boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is also in collaboration with people and lots of clinicians in the Scottish Muscle Network, and also the North Star Clinical Network, which obviously is strongly supported by MDUK and for which we're very grateful. One of the manuscripts and original research that Dr. Joseph was involved with is a large study on fractures and growth in boys with DMD using the North Star database. And that was awarded the Lober Prize by the Royal College of Pediatric and Child Health for original research article in pediatrics in 2020. And again, once again, very grateful for MDUK for the support. Next slide, please. So here, let's start off with steroid side effects. And we know that steroids are very useful and certainly is helpful for the muscles, but there are a range of side effects. And this is a survey which which a medical student has recently performed as part of his coursework, and very thankful for all the patient organizations, including MDUK, for circulating the survey. And just 2 slides just showing some of the side effects which really concern families and parents and carers of boys with DMD or a young person with DMD. We gave them a whole list of about 20-30 side effects, asked these families, the parents and also the young persons themselves to rate which side effects that actually concern them the most. And very interestingly, in fact, actually a lot of the bone and endocrine side effects actually came up really top of all the side effects which concern carers and boys with DMD. So you can see that long bone fractures, vertebral fractures, weight gain or obesity, delayed puberty, and a Cushingoid feature or round puffy face really were the top 5 side effects which concern carers. And in the boys with DMD, probably slightly different, some more appearance-based side effects like short stature, round face, and weight gain really concern these boys. So certainly bone and endocrine side effects greatly concern carers and people with DMD, and this is something that we need to try to address with further research. Next slide, please. So we know that steroids are very good for muscles, but steroids also do impact on bones directly by weakening the bones, predominantly by impacting on the cells that normally will form bones. We know that steroids like prednisolone and deflazacort also impact on growth and puberty in turn would normally actually improve bone development. And therefore, it's not surprising that boys who take steroids, whilst useful for the muscle, do have side effects of weaker bones or fragile bones, as we say. So next slide, please. You would then ask, perhaps, what are the consequences of these issues? So we know that low trauma fractures are very common in boys with DMD, and Dr. Joseph's work utilizing a cohort of patients from the Scottish Muscle Network showed that 50% of boys with DMD around the age of about 11.5 will have at least suffered 1 fracture. We know that long bone fracture is a nuisance, can cause pain, and in about 40 to 50% may also cause early loss of ambulation. More importantly, recently, we know that spinal compression fractures or vertebral fractures are very common and can be underestimated if diagnosed based purely just on severe back pain. But once spine compression fractures are present, these can maybe lead to further ongoing back pain in a more chronic stance, and also other health issues like potentially worsening some lung issues. Next slide, please. So utilizing data in collaboration with colleagues in Newcastle and also from the North Star database and Professor Montoni and Dr. Manso with the North Star Network, we looked at growth and also fractures in a large group of boys with DMD and found that in fact actually whilst that fractures was indeed higher, much higher than what we expect for healthy growing children, but there are also some differences between the different steroid regimen. We found that fractures and poor growth seems to be commoner in those on daily versus pulse or intermittent steroids, and that has been shown before. We also showed that poor growth seems to be commonest in those on daily deflazacort, and that weight gain or obesity may be commoner in those on daily prednisolone. But what was interesting is that we found that fractures, or reported fractures, mostly long bone fracture in this cohort, was in fact commonest in those treated with daily deflazacort. So certainly it does seem that there might be some differences between bone side effects or endocrine side effects between the steroid regimen, and this perhaps needs to be teased out a little bit more, because that could actually help risk-benefit discussion with clinicians and patients. Next slide, please. However, we do know that if we just purely look at back pain, probably about 10 to 20% of boys with DMD on steroids may have spine compression fracture presenting with significant or severe back pain. The spine compression fractures can be present without pain or very minimal pain. But once these fractures are identified on X-ray pictures, this shows that the bones are indeed very weak. And indeed, the current standards of care now recommends that we should be doing periodic X-rays to screen for these fractures. Next slide, please. The updated 2018 International Standards of Care recommends that boys on steroids should have a picture or X-ray of the back to screen for these compression fractures every 1 to 2 years. Recommendations are based on expert opinion, in particular relating to the optimal frequency of screening for these X-rays. And in 2018, when we did an audit of sites in the North Star network, asking how many sites are actually performing routine screening X-ray, probably only about 50% were actually doing that. So the evidence on the optimal frequency of spine monitoring to identifying spine compression fracture at the earliest possibility, minimizing exposure to unnecessary tests, and these involve some radiation, and also visit to the hospital, and reducing costs may be needed. Next slide, please. So you can see that these are some pictures of X-ray taken from the side on of a young person with DMD. And on the left, you can see that these are the rectangle shape of the vertebra or the backbones are entirely normal. You can see that on the right, you can see this is a boy who had lots of vertebral compression fractures because they're not rectangle shaped anymore. And it might not come as closely well on this slide, but the one in the middle shows a couple of vertebrae where they're not as rectangle as you expect. Based on some work of Dr. Shukas Joseph, which is currently still unpublished, we're still analyzing, again, thankfully supported by all the funders, including MDUK. We found that in 26 boys on daily steroids with no evidence fracture at baseline, if we perform annual screening X-ray, that actually at 1 year, 12%, and by 2 years, 35% had evidence of vertebral fracture. And 3 of the boys who had evidence of vertebral fracture at 1 year developed more of these fractures or more severe fractures with follow-up at 2 years. Next slide, please. So we do now know that there are actually effective treatment with bisphosphonate once these fractures are present to stop these fractures from developing further and to strengthen bones. But what we don't know is how frequent are compression fractures in steroid-treated boys with DMD with follow-up, and whether they do truly differ depending on steroid regimen. And these require research or studies where X-rays are done systematically and actually ideally reported by people who are experts in reading these X-rays. We don't also quite know the optimal frequency of spine monitoring to detect spine compression fracture at the earliest possibility. And there are also some issues with the clinical report that clinicians are receiving of these spine compression fractures, because these fractures are still very uncommon in the pediatric clinic, and perhaps some of our pediatric radiologists are not as used to looking at these X-rays and reporting these X-rays. Together with some of these people, particularly Dr. Michaela Guglieri from Newcastle, and also Professor Marka Afaya, an international well-known pediatric radiologist with an interest in bone, and also Dr. Nicola Crabtree in Birmingham, we're putting together a research proposal to study bone health, particularly vertebral fracture, in a large group of boys with DMD, in particular those who already have annual spine imaging as part of clinical care. We believe that this might actually give good information to families and clinicians on the risk-benefit of steroids. In time, it may also serve as a comparative control group to study the impact on new Duchenne therapies, and also with the hope of developing a standardized way of reporting these X-rays nationally to improve standard of care, facilitate research, and audit And I must also thank Elizabeth Groen from Duchenne Parent Project Netherlands, who has been very supportive of our research initiative. Next slide. Finally, in summary, hopefully in this short time, you've known that steroid side effects really does concern carers and people with DMD, particularly some of these endocrine and bone side effects. Steroids is likely to be part of the treatment, at least for some people with DMD, for the foreseeable future, although we will hear of lots of promising agents. Research into care have not received as much attention or focus previously, but should be prioritized, not just in pediatrics, but also in adults, which we will hear about that in a bit from Ross. Patient and patient groups can help highlight the importance of research into care, particularly for research funders. And I think innovative methods of research, particularly into aspects of care, are needed in rare conditions so that patients are not patients have the opportunity to take part in a lot of therapeutic clinical trials. Next slide. Just a whole lot of people to thank, some of whom who are here, Professor Montoni, Dr. Quinlivan, and also to MDUK and all the people who have supported our research in Glasgow. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jared. That was fantastic. Oh, and I love the skeleton. So whilst Kat switches over the slides to Professor Montoni's slides, I just wanted to remind people that there is an opportunity for you to type your questions into the Q&A functionality of Zoom. So if you wiggle your mouse around, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, probably at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon that says Q&A. And if you have questions, do feed them into those into that box, and we'll answer them for you. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over now to Professor Montoni, who's going to tell us about some of the clinical trials that's going on. Francesco, over to you.
Kate, thank you firstly for inviting me, and secondly for the work that MDUK does in the field. And I think Gerald gave a fantastic presentation, and a little bit was also like the contribution and the collaboration between his group and the North Star. So I think we're also very grateful for Gerald, because he brings an expertise that nobody else has. I've been asking in 10 minutes to summarize everything that is happening in research in Duchenne. It's very easy, and I'll do my best. And if you can go to the next slide. These are just my disclosure, but I think they will remain, the slides are with MDUK, so you can move to the next slide. And I will briefly touch on exon skipping using antisense oligonucleotides. I will be talking about AAV gene therapies. I would spend maybe 1 minute or so on strength and limitation of these different approaches, because as you probably have learned in life, nothing is perfect, and therefore I think the question is the pros and cons of everything is the tool that allows us to understand what how to move forward. And then I will briefly talk about the small molecules, because it's not only genetic therapy or gene therapy that I'm moving forward, but also other things. Next slide, please. So a fair question is on whether antisense oligonucleotide, especially the morpholino that has been around for for now quite a while, whether they do work or not. And I point you to recent published data that, if continue to support some effect of etapilsen for skipping exon 51. And in a paper that has just been published in Journal of Neuromuscular Disorders, I think it's in June or July, there is a cumulative effect of both effect on walking abilities, but also on respiratory function in people who have been recruited into every single study and have received etapilsen. And the cumulative data from a walking perspective suggests that, unfortunately, children receiving etapilsen continue to decline, but the slope of decline has been slowed down, so that children receiving the treatment have a 21% longer ambulation, and at least in the period that was studied during this study, there was a 47% reduction of loss of ambulation. And also, I think there was approximately half of the respiratory yearly decline compared to untreated patient. And the next slide is now another antisense oligonucleotide. This is, there is a misspelling I just realized now, is golodirsen. Is to skip exon 53, not exon 51. I apologize, I should know this because this is our clinical trial, but I apologize for that mistake. And we have presented data at the World Muscle Society, and there is a manuscript that is essentially accepted pending some editorial changes in nucleic acid research that gives the information regarding the children who were recruited in the original clinical trial that we started in London, Newcastle, in Rome, and in Paris. And again, not very dissimilar from what I described for the Pilsen. There was a reduction. The patient who received the golodirsen still declined, but in 3 years, they lost 99 meters compared to 182 meters of children who did not receive the golodirsen. And there was a reduction of the risk of losing ambulation during these 3 years compared to untreated controls. And also, there was a reduction of the respiratory decline, again, of values that are not very dissimilar from epipils. And so I think these are some evidence, at least, that the drugs appear to do something. We always would like more, but this, at least we know what these drugs are doing. Next slide, please. An important point, and I think many of you, depending on what is your what your child has, will be aware of this, that many of the clinical trials performed by the company is called Sarepta, are coming to an end, or they just finish as well. And the company is transitioning. What happens at the end of the clinical trial is an important point, that this is not unique for antisense oligonucleotide. And the company has agreed to make the drug freely available, what is called on a compassionate use. The compassionate use follows a different path compared to the experimental drugs in the clinical research facilities, because it will be prescribed by the primary physician, a primary pediatrician of the children, and this treatment can be received closer to home. And we hope with as long as possible home dosing. I think certainly home dosing will be available until the end of this year, but we hope for significantly longer than that. And I think that we have been in touch with every single site where both from, every site in the UK that has been involved is aware, of course, of this. So we have been informing the families and the clinicians of when their kids will come out of the clinical trial, so that if families want compassionate use, that could be given. The next slide. I think that this is a brief summary. I think that it would be fair to say that the morpholino antisense PMOs are safe and on the whole well tolerated even after years. That I think is so far a fair assessment. I think will be also fair to say that there is some dystrophin produced, but the level are low, and the efficacy takes time to be clear, and at least 2 to 3 years of treatment are necessary to appreciate a divergence from the expected course. And I think that especially the data on the epipils that has been now treatment for longer suggests that this effect are cumulative. So especially the respiratory function decline, for example, tend to become a smaller yearly decline the longer you have been on the drug. The next slide is, of course, the results are there, but they are modest. And the question is, could we aim for more? And of course, both you and us as a clinician and the companies are thinking the same. And a few things that are happening is the Sarepta is initiating a higher dose epipilsen trial. Just to give an idea, we currently use 30 milligram, 30 per kilo. and this trial will go up to 200 milligrams per kilo, so nearly 10 times the dose. But also there is a modification of the morpholino called peptide morpholino PPMO that appears to be much more potent in very early clinical studies, although there is some safety signal that at the moment the companies try to address. And there are also other companies, one is Dyne Therapeutics, that will start soon, also another modified antisense oligonucleotide, and time will tell how much better these are compared to the morpholino. Next slide. I think that if you just move until the end of this, because I didn't realize, just go one forward, please. Yeah, another one, and that's it. So you are all aware that as we speak, there are 4 underway clinical trials for Duchenne, and a 5th one is about or will start soon. And this is each of the companies use a relatively similar microdystrophin. The reason why these are called microdystrophins is that you cannot put the entire gene in an AAV vector, it's just too big. So I think that there is a Becker-like molecule that has been optimized to have hopefully as much efficacy as possible. Next slide. I only have one slide of where we are, because in a way to give a detailed information will probably take 2 hours. But I think here are a few key points. Firstly, in dystrophin production, I think in the 3 trials in which data have been available are at level that probably have exceeded the expectation of many, and they are expected to provide clinical benefit. So that I think is a very good news. I think that it's also fair to say that there's been some variability, and some patients appear to have more, some patients have a little less, and I think it's a bit early to understand this variability. I think that in several of the treated patients, the data so far support the fact that these patients are better after treatment. I don't think it would be unfair to say this. However, this is not invariable, and some patients only remain stable. And of course, stability for Duchenne is already okay, and the question will be, how long will stability last? And I would also say that there have been, the one of you who followed this clinical trial probably are aware that essentially, most of the companies have encountered obstacles. Actually, in fairness, most of the children, not only the company, have found obstacles, and some substantial adverse events have been experienced by several children. And I think that the last point, therefore, is that the full spectrum of safety and efficacy of this new product, I think, will take longer to be fully ascertained. I think that there is a big step forward, but at the same time, things are still happening. Next slide, please. This briefly summarizes the pros and cons of the different treatment, and I think this just put in a format what I have described to you, and again, this could be shared afterwards, but there is nothing different from what I said, but it is in a table format. The last slide, next one, is as I indicated, there is progress not only on gene therapy or genetic therapies, but also on small molecules. And I just chosen one, also because this one, a bit like Gerald was saying, gives a sense of why a network like the North Star that is supported by MDUK is useful. And this is a study we have done in collaboration between the North Star and the colleagues from the vamorolone. This is a external. I wasn't involved in the clinical trial, but what we have done, we have helped the colleagues from the vamorolone study to match the treatment effect of vamorolone compared to children in the North Star who receive only corticosteroid. And because the point is, the vamorolone is hopefully going to have much less impact on many of the aspects that Gerald has mentioned. But at the same time, we would like to know how good it is in terms of the good thing that steroids do in children with Duchenne. And I think that the comparative study suggested that there was no difference in clinical efficacy between children receiving vamorolone and steroids, indicating that at least in the time course of that study for a period of 2 years, both vamorolone and the other steroid were very were efficacious in a similar way. Of course, a difference is that the children on vamorolone showed stable height percentile over time, and Gerald mentioned that growth stunting is one of the major concerns, especially for children and young people. So I think this is encouraging. I think, again, this is an evolving situation. This is a study drug that is still under clinical trial evaluation, but I think this is new. This data will be presented in 2 weeks' time at the World Muscle Society. So I thought this was a useful information. So this is my last slide, and I think it just moves to the next one, where there is just the acknowledgement. And as you realize, probably the one that of the various things that we discussed do the least. Many people do a lot of work, and we work certainly very well with the MDUK and North Star, and of course we are we work also in collaboration with other advocacy groups in the Duchenne field, both in this country and abroad. And with this, I've concluded.
Francesco, thank you so much. That was a fantastic talk, and sorry for curtailing you for your time, but you've managed to really cover a wide range, and I think it was really, really interesting. There are a few questions that have popped up. One of them actually is, could you explain the difference between exon 51 and exon 53? You mentioned about the opportunity to use drugs that can skip these, but could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, I think that for those interested in this, there are online online material, both from several advocacy groups, but also the companies that develop these. And I think that the reason is not that it's not a physician preference, but I think it's depending on where the misspelling is in the gene. I think what the antisense do, they trim the area very close to where the misspelling, the mutation of the child is. And if your child, I'll make an example, has a misspelling in exon 44, what you need to trim is different compared to a child who has a misspelling around exon 52. And therefore, this drug, what we call personalized drug, they work for a subset of children because they only work for those kids who have a mutation in that particular area. So the exon 51 will work for children who have the more common type of mutation around exon 48, 50, 49, 50, things like that. The exon 53 will work for children with mutation a little more towards the end of the gene.
And are there actually trials going on with, we've mentioned 51 and 53, and you mentioned some other exons there. Are there other treatments that are skipping other exons, so to speak, that are going on too?
So there is one clinical trial that's also skipping 45, and this is a clinical trial we are involved, and is one of those trials that will be coming very soon to end with the compassionate use of children. This is the drug called casimersen, but I think it's still too early to have clinical data, and the company has released some information regarding the protein data, but I thought people are interested in, does this make my child better? So I concentrate on some of the clinical aspects. And the other companies, there is one particular company that is on the early, I think that they plan a 2022 trial for an exon that is not 45, not 51, is not 53, but I think that this is still is nearly there as an approval, and is in a slightly different area. But then there are two companies one is Sarepta, the other is Dyne Therapeutics, that have already either a modified 51 PPMO or a new generation that's completely different produced by Dyne Therapeutics that will, if like they already declared, they finalized the FDA package. They have I will expect them to start probably before the end of this year.
Great. Okay, thank you. And we've had a question from someone who says that their son has an exon 52 de novo mutation and he's recently lost his mobility. Are there any trials or any treatments that could help him walk again?
Well, I think that this is a, let me step back a little and say, antisense oligonucleotide make a little of the production of dystrophin, but the level are quite low, especially the current generation. But even gene therapy that makes a lot of dystrophin, this treatment don't grow muscle again. That's the reality. They protect the muscle that is there. They make some dystrophin. Dystrophin protect muscle. However, if a child has lost the ability to walk, the probability that any of this treatment, as they are at the moment, will repair the muscle and make a new muscle grow and make that particular individual walk again, that at the moment is not something that the field can really give for granted at all. And I think that there is certainly a lot of work in regenerative medicine to try to improve the also regenerative capacity of the muscle. But this treatment will not achieve regeneration of, if you lost muscle or you lost 30% of your muscle after this treatment, you will not have 100% of your muscle. You still have whatever you had that will be left intact for much longer. So I think in reality, I think there will be clinical trials also for the non-ambulant people with also for antisense oligonucleotide, for example, and also for gene therapy, because although walking is important to some extent, other aspects like upper limb function, respiratory function are as important, and to some extent probably walking is a little overrated. And there are many other things that make people function properly in real life. So I think that there is nothing that has been developed for non-ambulant people. But if the question is, where the field is today, if somebody has lost walking, could this be any of this treatment will achieve walking again? The honest answer is I don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much, Jared. Maybe we can turn to you. You've obviously spoken about the effects of the steroids on bone health, and Francesco mentioned about this fantastic potential with the other small drug that's being compared to it, the valmorolone. Has anyone been looking at the bone health of people who have been taking valmorolone? I probably didn't say the name right, sorry.
So Musa, you will know that there is a clinical trial, the Vision DMD clinical trial, which I think is coming to an end soon. I think the endpoint will be either end of this year or early next year. As part of that clinical trial, fractures is being looked at. So to date, there's nothing published. As Francesco mentioned, I think it is a compound which works like steroid, but it's thought not to have some of the steroid side effects. I guess we're all waiting in anticipation to see how much, how well it works. It seems to be working, but how much of the steroid side effect it reduces, or does it completely eliminate all the side effects? So short answer is no, but we hope that it will actually be more bone sparing.
So it's a case of watch this space then, it seems. So well, that's grand, thank you. There's a question about whether there are any trials for exon skipping 3 to 7. I don't know whether, sorry, Jared, I imagine this is one for Francesco, but Francesco, I don't know whether you know.
Not at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And one other question at the moment. We've obviously been talking a lot about pediatric trials and pediatric research, and the focus pretty much around this week around the World Duchenne Awareness Day has been around adults with living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I wondered whether you're aware of any trials that are being carried out, or any studies that will be carried out in adults, and maybe also slightly going against protocol. I also looked to Professor Ros Quinlivan, who's joined us, who is also on the line. So perhaps between you, maybe Ros, I could turn to you first, and we'll introduce you later. Sorry to go backwards on that. You're on mute still.
Sorry, Kate, can you repeat that question again,
yes,
please?
Sure. Are there studies or clinical trials that are involving adults with Duchenne? Because we've obviously been talking a lot about children's and pediatric studies, but I just wondered whether there was anything you know of in the adult population.
Well, in terms of clinical trials, obviously there was the Sideros trial, which is now finished. That was that involved adult patients, and we're currently in the process of setting up the Lelantos trial, which is for adults with Duchenne as well. So that will be starting fairly soon. That's a multinational study. And that's looking at the effect of an antifibrotic agent in Duchenne. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the Adult North Star Network, because what we really want to do is actually acquire some natural history research for adults with Duchenne, because I think there's a lot of issues that we don't really know enough about, and we need to understand, what happens to people as they get older.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I think we haven't read any more. There was one question. Sorry, I just remembered. There's one more question. This is for Francesco and for Jared. If families are interested in enrolling their sons in trials, how should they go about that? Maybe Jared, you could answer that.
Well, I guess, contacting your local clinician and specialist will be the first option, basically. I'm aware that I think there is the research line with MDUK that there are obviously people who can point you in the right direction, but certainly I think your local specialist is probably a good place to start. Francesco may actually have more specific answers.
No. Well, in reality, I think that multiple line of communication are useful, and I would always advise to discuss this with your local physician, even if he or she is not involved in clinical trial, for two reasons. Firstly, because this person is aware of the interest you have in research, and that is still useful. And secondly, that there is, for example, the North Star Network. We often make call for saying we are looking for a child or 3 children, whatever, who may be eligible for this particular clinical trial. I think that there is the DMD hub that also collects information, and I think you should consider to make an expression of this to the DMD hub. And then many sites, including ours, will accept. We have a standard operative procedure in our clinical research facility on how to receive, acknowledge, and prioritize expression of interest without trying to promise that we will recruit children. There is a system that allows us to recruit children randomly, so that we are not favoring any particular, the children who are white, well, or the children who only are follow that gosh. So we have a system that allows, if you like, equal access to the clinical trial. But I think that we have in the UK, on the whole, a good system. I think, again, the North Star network has facilitated recruitment over many years, and whether this is born, whether this is heart protection, the heart protection study that was run by the colleagues in Newcastle, for example, recruited approximately 100 children, or probably a little more, all over the country, and these were multiple North Star locations. So I think we have a good system, but speak with your colleague and consider some of the other suggestions that I made.
Super, thank you very much. So I think that concludes our research session for today. So thank you to Jared and to Francesco so much for your time and your input. It's been fascinating and really informative, and I'll hand back to Rob now for the next session.
Thanks, Kay, and and thanks, Jared and Francesco. That was fantastic. I think you're both staying with us. I think for the rest of the session as well. So we may call on you in future bits as well. just before I sort of formally move to the next session with Ros, it's a rare occasion when we publicly have Ros and Francesco together. So just wanted to say that Ros and Francesco, two of the four clinicians who were really instrumental in helping us produce our COVID guidance over the past 18 months, but well, feels a bit longer now. So just a huge public thank you to you two, because you've kept us on the straight and narrow. And also I can see our friends from the Duchenne family support group are on the line as well. So I know that we've coordinated with them as well. So I know they're very grateful. So thank you. It's been a great help sort of making sure that we're accurate in our advice, and you've often turned things around very quickly and at the last minute, in line with the government policy of only releasing things quickly and at last minute. So thank you very much. So I'll move us on now to a section on adult standards of care. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ros Quinlivan, who we've already heard from already, and she's going to join us to talk about some work supported by MDUK that was published this week around standards of care for adults living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And we were delighted that was the central focus of Tuesday's World Duchenne Awareness Day. Ros benefited from being in a live studio audience, a live studio with a professional presenter, but I'm sure she's more at home with Kate and I in this Zoom setting. Ros trained in paediatric neuromuscular disease and was the first clinical neuromuscular fellow at Guy's Hospital, funded by the then Muscular Dystrophy campaign, so that's now MDUK. She's currently based at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, and she developed and is the clinical lead for the Neuromuscular Complex Care Centre at Queen Square. She's also a key member of our Services Development Committee and is chair of the British Myology Society. Ros, over to you. We've got your slides up, I think, already, which is fantastic. So Kat will guide us through the slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Robert, and also Kate for inviting me to join today. So we can go on to the next slide, Kat, if that's right. Thank you. So, it's sorry, the formatting's gone a little bit strange, but as everybody knows, there are international standards of care for Duchenne, and they were first published in 2010 and then updated in 2018. And these standards of care, I think, have been really instrumental in improving the outcomes for children and teenagers with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But they are predominantly focused for children and adolescents. And although adults are mentioned, they don't really go into detail in terms of adult care. But because we have better quality care, we have more and more adults coming through to our services. And so we felt there was a real need to develop the adult services further. So next slide, please. And you might ask, well, you know, why do we need additional standards of care? Why can't you just use the standards of care that are already there? Well, I think there are a number of issues. Firstly, for adults, there's a change in emphasis. In children, what you're trying to do is delay or prevent complications of Duchenne. But in adults, we're actually quite often having to treat conditions that have arisen. So it's a different emphasis. We're also now seeing a much more varied population of adults. We've always had a population of steroid naive adults, and these people are now getting older. Some of them are well into their 40s, many of them in their 30s, and these people are becoming increasingly frail, and their medical issues are becoming increasingly complex because everybody, whether you've got Duchenne or not, has an increased likelihood of developing something else as you get older. So we have new medical issues emerging. Also, relatively new, within the last 7 to 8 years, are an increasing population of adults who are on steroids and have been on steroids for more than 10 years. And there are still a number of adult neurologists who choose to stop steroids the minute somebody enters the adult services. And so we felt that there's a need to actually agree a consensus on what to do with steroids. And finally, we have to bring in different specialists that are not included in the pediatric standards of care or the international standards of care. Gastrointestinal and nutritional problems are a big issue for many adults. We also quite often now need to involve our nephrology or kidney specialists for our patients. We also are referring people to adult endocrinologists. So you've heard from Jared, you know, how important endocrine and bone health is for Duchenne patients. And our adult colleagues are less familiar with the aspects of steroid care. And finally, general anaesthetics required for surgical procedures and all sorts of other specialists, pain specialists, palliative care specialists. I could go on, but there's a long list of specialists that we need to bring in the adults. Next slide, please. So I really am very, very grateful to Muscular Dystrophy UK who funded this project. The Adult North Star Network was started in 2015, and we received a research grant from Muscular Dystrophy UK to fund a PhD student to coordinate and develop this work. We've pulled together a multidisciplinary network of clinicians, very similar to the Pediatric North Star Network, but the clinicians that we involve are all involved in the care of adults. And we all agreed that there was a need to standardise the care across the UK so that all adults could expect to receive the same level of care. And for that, we needed to develop our own management guidelines. The research part of this is the long-term natural history database. So it's similar to the Pediatric North Star database. And you've heard from Jared how important that database is for understanding the best levels of care and understanding the implications of our treatments. And so this is going to be a really positive platform for future research to improve the outcomes of clinical care. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into detail about the guidance, but it covers these topics. The respiratory chapter was put together by a collaboration between all of the respiratory leads who work in major ventilatory centres. We have a separate topic on anaesthetics, which again goes into a lot of detail about the preparation and the planning for general anaesthesia. And we really emphasise the importance of anaesthetics not being delivered in a local hospital. They have to be delivered in a specialist centre with very good coordination and communication between the respiratory, neuromuscular and cardiology experts. We have a much more detailed section on cardiology, again written by a group of cardiologists, where they're actually looking at treatment beyond ACE inhibitors and beta blockers. So talking about management of heart failure, management of heart rhythm disorders. We have a section on nutrition and bowel and a section on renal issues in our patients. And this is really guidance based on consensus of expert opinion, because the amount of evidence in the literature for treatment for these conditions is very, very limited. We have a section on endocrine and bone, and I have to thank Jared for his involvement in this. He was one of the key people leading this section. And finally, what I would call the 3 Ps, psychosocial, participation and palliative care. And we've also developed a second publication, which includes a therapy manual, because all adults with Duchenne should have access to the full range of therapies. And again, that's a problem for many patients. We're hoping that's going to be published soon as well. Next slide, please. So how did we develop this guidance? Well, again, we are very grateful to Muscular Dystrophy UK for supporting us with this. We started by developing the network, and then we had a one-day workshop for service users to try and understand their priorities. And I think that, I can't remember the exact number, but there may have been about 20 service users and their carers attended. We've had multiple workshops involving the whole North Star network, and also smaller subspecialist workshops looking at specific issues. And all of this work synthesized the existing literature. We took on board the international standards of care. We also used other workshop reports that have been published by the ENMC and also Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy in the Netherlands. And we extrapolated data from other patient populations. So for example, heart failure data from other patient populations. And together we put together this a consensus. So everybody agreed on what they felt was the best practice. And then each of those topics was collated into a single report, into a small report, and then they were collated into one large document. And then that document was peer reviewed by the whole network, and then also by expert users and by the journal. Next slide, please. But I have to say, this is really only a beginning. This is the first ever published standard of care for adults with Duchenne. And it's a beginning because much of the guidance is based on expert opinion, and there is very little published research into the management of adults with Duchenne. As Jared was saying, we need more research on patient care. But this guidance is really important because we hope it will standardize care. We hope it will help us learn through this guidance what the best management will be, and it will stimulate thought, discussion, research. And hopefully this will evolve with time. So this will not be the only guidance ever published. Next slide, please. And it's really important because for a number of reasons, actually, you know, health commissioners, the people who fund services, will not fund services or therapies where there is no published evidence. So having something published is really important for getting proper resources into services, because adult Duchenne services are under-resourced. And also a document like this can be used by patients to ensure that they're getting the right care for themselves. We think in terms of, if you like, the key points that come out of this document are that all patients, all adults with Duchenne should be seen in a specialist centre. All of the clinicians working with these patients should be communicating with each other, and there should be very close liaison between these specialist areas. As I've already mentioned, general anaesthesia should only be taken in a specialist centre where there's an intensive care, and that patients should have access to a full range of therapy services. So we know, for example, that physiotherapy and hydrotherapy are really limited for adult patients. And also we know that we need to develop more research, particularly into nutrition. What's the best nutrition for adults with Duchenne? How to manage bowel problems, how to manage renal problems. And actually there's evolving evidence on how to manage heart failure with new drugs being developed. And we mentioned some of those in the publication. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, and also I would like to thank the Journal of Neuromuscular Diseases, who actually rushed this to press to get it out in time for World Duchenne Day, which was on Tuesday. And I have to also thank Elizabeth Vroom for also being instrumental in supporting us with this. But I think it's really important that I stress that this document does not replace the international standards of care, but it's used as an adjunct to support adults. Emphasising all adults with Duchenne should be seen in specialist centres where they liaise closely between specialists, but also liaise closely with the local hospital as well. And we need better evidence care. And this is where our natural history database, the North Star database, collecting data on that from the patients that come to clinics in the UK is going to really help us to improve care as time goes on. And finally, we are working on a patient-friendly version, which will be, thanks to Elizabeth Vroom as well, published in multiple languages as well. So just the last slide, please. And I'd just like to thank, again, Muscular Dystrophy UK for funding this work and supporting it. I'd like to thank all of the members of the North Star Network. I'd like to thank our user group and also the lay experts who peer-reviewed our document before publication, and of course the ENMC and Duchenne Parent Project Netherlands, who funded workshops in whom we incorporated their guidance in our work as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Roz. That was fantastic, and yeah, far better than a slick TV production of it. Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited about working at Muscular Dystrophy UK on taking those into a kind of patient-friendly version. So watch this space for more information. And also, if you look on our website now, and we'll probably send a link round to attendees, there's fantastic resources on the website that we published this week with a blog from Ros and other updates about the standards of care and about the work we're doing. So thank you very much. I'm now going to move us on to the sort of final sort of section of the afternoon, which is around living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. A quick reminder that you can continue to ask questions through the Q&A function. I will bring those into the discussion as we continue on. I'm going to introduce two additional panelists now who are joining us, who've been very patient for the past hour. So thank you very much to Nick and Vivek. I'll introduce them first. So Nick Emery is a specialist adult and children neuromuscular physiotherapist at the Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt Orthopaedic and District NHS Hospital at Oswestry. We in the UK call it Oswestry for short. Nick qualified as a physio in 2005 after being a firefighter in London for 18 years and has spent his entire physio career in neuromuscular disease. He works in a multidisciplinary team with 2 neuromuscular consultants and 2 physiotherapists and a sort of broad team around him. And he runs independent physio clinics providing advice and care for musculoskeletal pain in neuromuscular disease. Vivek lives with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and is a hugely valued MDUK volunteer. He's a passionate gamer and user of and blogger on assistive and accessible technology. And I think, Vivek, when I began my role at MDUK many moons ago, although it's only 3 years actually, I think you were one of the first people I came to see. So it's great to have you with us. Before I turn to the panel who are with us live, we wanted to cover in this session some gastric issues, but unfortunately Dr. Anton Emmanuel, professor in neurogastroenterology at University College London, couldn't join us, but has provided a short video to share with us, which we'll now show. So Kat, if you're ready to show that, we'll then go live to the panel.
Thanks for inviting me to participate in this session. I'm sorry I can't join you in person, but I'd like to spend some time, if I may, just with the background I have of being a specialist gastroenterologist who's done a lot of work with patients who have present some of the outline of what happens to patients and what we can try and do to help them. Just to give a sense of actually these are a set of symptoms which are common, but also which are symptoms which we can try and help with. They're not necessarily just pointers to discuss because there's nowhere to go with them. I hope I can give some hope that actually some of these symptoms which can be very burdensome can be addressed at least partially to be relieved. I say this in front of the fact that obviously, as everyone joining this session knows, gastrointestinal GI problems are a small part of the burden facing patients and families and carers with Duchenne and other neuromuscular diseases. It's one component, but I would say it's also a very important component. So whilst it may not be directly life-threatening in the way that the heart and other things can be, it has an enormous impact on quality of life, as we all know how important it is to be able to get nutrition in and to have that sense of control over our own guts. So if we think about the gut as one long tube from your mouth down to your bottom end, unfortunately, adults and children with Duchenne can get problems throughout that length of the gut. You can begin at the very top end, especially with swallowing difficulties. And swallowing difficulties have a huge impact, obviously, because you can't get nutrition in, but also there's the hydration, but also dealing with saliva. And so you can see the things that we're looking out for, and a lot of you will be very familiar with, having been asked about many times, is about weight loss and weight change and how difficult it is to measure, of course. About how long it takes to consume food. Sometimes we can manage to avoid losing weight. Families can, but it takes an inordinate amount of time to do that. There's a huge sense of fatigue after meals. Sometimes it can be that actually the first warning sign is that saliva can't be dealt with properly. So you get that kind of very wet voice, which you may have heard some patients describe. And of course, at the worst end, the thing we're trying to avoid most is if food or other material starts getting into the lungs and cause symptomatic presentations of pneumonia, or even more worrying in some ways is when that happens gradually and there's a progressive loss of lung function, which may be due to, at least in part, gut symptoms which are not being recognized. And that is important. Which we swallow is just a
Hi everybody. Sorry, I'm gonna cut in and ask my colleague Kat to stop the video. We're really sorry. It sounds like we've got some sound problems. So I think what we'll do is rather than ask a panelist to step in and present someone else's slides on an area of highly specialized expertise, we've got the presentation available. So we'll send that, we'll either put it on the website once we get permission or send it around to people who have logged in. So a huge apologies for that, but we'll just move straight into the next part, which is the discussion around sort of living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Apologies, it took a few moments for us to realize how bad the sound was. So Vivek, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. So Duchenne World Awareness Day focused this year on adults living with Duchenne, and I'd love to hear from you just a bit about your experience and how you coordinate the support you need and the adaptations you've made to help you keep doing the things you love.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to explain a bit about kind of what I do, and I'm like an accessibility specialist. I talk to game developers about like making games better. Yeah, so I'm focused on like technology. So I coordinate my care quite well. In the lockdown, I've lost a couple of carers, so kind of it's been a little bit of a struggle in that way too, because of COVID and safety and things. So kind of I manage at home with my mum and my sister. They have kind of help in the meantime. So it's just kind of finding the support in that way when a lot of people that I know are losing carers a lot during COVID. So that's how I like coordinate my care. But a lot of what I do in the day is based around computers. Like I do a lot of I write articles for like a gaming website, and I do quite a few things like talk at gaming conferences. So through that, I've learned to manage it through technology. I found the lockdown has been a lot better for me because I'm at home. I don't have to kind of travel to places. So my setup is kind of quite good. Like I can't use a keyboard, so I've just got a mouse that's got 11 buttons, and it's very sensitive. So I need to kind of make my environment accessible. So I don't need as much help as possible, because I still like to be independent and do a lot of things myself, even though I rely on people for a lot of physical help.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful. That's great. And I think we'll return to a couple of those points in a minute. So, Nick, can I sort of turn to you as well, and just sort of, I wonder if you could just give a bit of overview of the kind of physiotherapy support that you and colleagues provide, and also why it's so important for people living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I know I'm going to put you in the. I think you cover children and adults. So perhaps you could break into two bits if there isn't a crossover.
Yeah, I think that's really important that it's. Because we have a team that looks after both paediatric and adult, there's no transition. So I think that's a really nice for our patients, that they don't have to suddenly change clinicians and therapists, that we've known these children who grow to then be teenagers and then into adults. So we get to know them very well, and that does help with managing their care and their needs. So from an earlier, so that teenage years, we're preparing them for transition. And then once they are starting to go into transition, it's opening up the opportunities that are available to them. And that might be education, it might be as, gaming or assistive technologies, making sure wheelchairs are right, making sure all the things are in place before they enter the adult world. Because when they enter that adult world, things do change. Unfortunately, physiotherapy stops because there isn't much access to adult care. They might have been used to having hydrotherapy on a regular basis. Unfortunately, that stops. But from our point of view, it is trying, and I think reiterate what Ros said, is we've now come from moving into trying preventing declining condition to treating changes in condition. So we're looking to make sure that cardiology is carried out on a regular basis. Respiratory assessments are carried out on a regular basis. And we're lucky we've got home monitoring. So we're monitoring our patients at home in a respiratory if they're not in an IV, so that we can see any declines in respiratory function, get a sleep study done, and then intervene early with NIV or refer to a respiratory so that they can take on that care. Also from the care advisor's point of view, making sure that homes have been adapted prior to that transition, and most have, but some don't. Making sure that houses are appropriate. There's lots of problems around housing. So in terms of physiotherapy, it's never just physiotherapy. It always goes beyond that. So you have to think about lots of different aspects of care. Pain can be a big issue. And as Jared said about spinal fractures, vertebral fractures, we're monitoring that on a regular basis. So it is putting those things in place, but it's also trying to encourage that independence. So trying to encourage a little bit of activity. Hesitate to use the word exercise because I don't think that's appropriate. I think trying to maintain some upper limb function, maybe trying to mitigate loss of range of movement. So a little bit of stretching. I know the boys don't like it, but sometimes it does help. And if they go into adulthood, if they're in a better range, a better position, that can help mitigate pain. The list is probably endless of what we do. And it's just when you come to think about it, you can't. And then half an hour later, we go, oh, I didn't mention this, I didn't mention that. But I think that gives a general overview of the kind of care that we provide. And it's not just physio, it encompasses the whole kit and caboodle.
Thanks, Nick. And I sort of open out to Ros and Francesco. I think Nick sort of usefully touched on all the various aspects and the holistic support that needs to be built around someone living with Duchenne, whether they're a child or an adult. Just wondered if you could maybe come to you first, Ros, just talk about the kind of sort of team that you work with as a consultant to support people, and maybe if you talk about your adult experience, and then move to Francesco to talk about children, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, you really do need a complex team for sure. And so we have what's very necessary is physiotherapy, not just for the limbs, as Nick was talking about, that's important, but also for the chest. So you need a separate chest physiotherapist. Again, when we're looking at seating issues, that's done jointly with the physiotherapist and the occupational therapist. And often the occupational therapist is important in looking at the hands and the hand function and maintaining good positions in the hands. Speech and language therapists, as we couldn't really hear Anton's talk very well, but I know he mentions issues with swallowing. And the speech and language therapist often sees people jointly with the dietitian, because you need involvement of both the nutritionist and the speech and language therapist. And then they also then will liaise with the gastroenterologist around those swallowing issues, weight issues, nutrition issues. The respiratory physiotherapist works very closely with the respiratory physician. And also we have respiratory physiologists who interpret all of the sleep studies we do. We have very integral to our service is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, to manage some of those complex problems that we see in patients with anxiety, depression, phobias, fears, and they can interact and interfere with patient treatment. So the clinical psychologist is really important. And then the cardiologist and the echo technician. So it's a very, very large team that's involved in the care of patients. And actually what we try and do is a link with the local therapy services. But as Nick said, that can be challenging and it can depend on where you live and what's available locally. So that's very variable across the country.
Thanks, Ros. And yeah, and Francesco, is it a very similar model with children, or are there sort of differences in the team that you would help coordinate?
Well, the challenges are the same, and to some extent the challenges will be probably they are the same, but they may be slightly different in different places depending on what what is available to you. And I have, you may think, and I'm grateful for the fact that we work in a comprehensive pediatric hospital. I would still not consider that we can offer a 360-degree full care the way I would, in an ideal world, do it. And this is not a criticism to us, but I think it's a reality of life. And as we speak, you see that I'm looking right and left because I'm putting together the slides, because at 3 o'clock we have our first engagement. I'm using it as an example. We have our first engagement with the clinical psychology for the neuropsychiatric and therapeutic options that could be available for some children or young people with EMD. At the moment, we completely ignore this part. And I'm quite ashamed, quite frankly, but that's why we are now meeting with these colleagues. But the point is that if your physician, like us, at the moment don't provide this, it's not only because we are inefficient. This is going to be the first meeting of a very long series of meetings to establish a business case and to eventually have, because the clinical colleague in the psychology department is not that they are there waiting and doing nothing, and they already very stretched. So this is to build a relationship and to increase our capacity in that particular area that at the moment we don't follow at all. So I'm using this as an example of how, if you like, the care needs to evolve, the needs need to evolve, our understanding of what needs to be provided evolves, and is a process that needs to be, to check what is the next thing that you need to do for your patient. And with the funding restraint is not that we don't want to do it, it's not that we don't know how to do it, it's just how can you effectively do it. But I'm preparing the slides to start the process for a future business case in this area.
Thank you, Francesco. I mean, to build on a couple of sort of points that have come out already just from this discussion, Nick, I wonder, first of all, so Ros mentioned the specialist services and sort of general services, community services. In terms of with physio in particular, I think there is, you're a specialist physio at a centre. Do you liaise with community physios who may also see people with Duchenne who, and those physios may not have that specialist Duchenne or muscular neuromuscular knowledge? How does that work?
Yeah, we do. We're actually running a teaching day next Friday for local hospices for the physiotherapists there, so that they can become more aware of what the needs are. Although they are probably the people who have more knowledge because they work in hospice, so they would see people with Duchenne on a more regular basis. We will certainly keep in contact with our community colleagues, more so in the paediatric field than the adult field. Community adult physiotherapy is few and far between, so mainly it would be done through local hospitals. And unfortunately, most would go through the sort of neurophysio route because it's got the word neuromuscular in it, which isn't great. So I get quite a lot of inquiries about, I've been referred to this patient, what should I do? And it's I don't know, maybe I'm coming from a point of knowledge, but I always think, well, you assess and then you treat what you find. And it's not rocket science. We're not asking you to do something exceptional. But I welcome inquiries. I'd rather have inquiries than none, because that shows at least people are interested in what's going on and what these patients need. And their best care is what we really want.
Thanks, Nick. And then another, Ros has raised her hand. Ros,
I was just going to echo Francesco's comments, and also Nick actually as well, because to be honest, there's not enough people to go around, even in the specialist centres. So we all do what we can, but there's just not enough of these sort of staff around. We need to work on that, I think.
Thanks, Ros.
No, ideally, I mean, I'd like to see our Duchenne or most of our patients on a more regular basis, so that we have that one-to-one care. We have talked about doing group sessions in our gym. Once COVID's over, we might start opening it up and bring a group of FSHD patients, Duchenne, Charcot-Marie-Tooth patients together, so they can have a gym session, so they can understand what they can do in a gym environment. And I'd love to see people on a more regular basis, but we've got 1,200 patients to look after, and we've got very limited time. I'm part-time, 2 colleagues are part-time, about 50 hours a week between us. So we don't have a lot of time to do what we'd really like to do.
Yeah.
Vivek, you've raised your hand. Have you got a point to come in here?
Yeah, I was just going to say that when I was younger, like I never liked exercise or physio because kind of I found it quite boring because it wasn't shown to me in a relevant way. Whereas now that I do a lot of gaming and using my hands, I wish I did a lot more physio at the age. But I think if it was shown in a relevant way, like it seems that might be happening now, I'm more likely to kind of do physio and enjoy it, because I do realize that starting at a young age doing physio is good, because I always have physio every day in the morning, and that's really kind of helped me prepare for my day, really. So I don't know, I just feel a lot more relaxed.
I think that's a really good segue actually into a question that's come in live, which is from someone who asked that, should my son, who is 13, be having any regular physio sessions? They only have routine assessments at the moment. They take the son swimming, but is there anything else you'd suggest? Nick, I presume that's probably you to kick off with. I saw every panelist nod, but I think Nick, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I would say that the more regular that your son can have physiotherapy, if you have a community physiotherapist, ask them to put together a little plan for you. If you would like, I'm sure that someone can forward my email address to you, and I'm more than happy to give you some generic stuff, but not knowing your son, it's going to be quite difficult. But I would say that doing some, depending on their stage, I would say that if you can get doing some little arm cycling, because you can get little pedals that you can use on the floor or for arms, and they only need to do a few minutes. You can get powered ones. They're a little bit more expensive, around £100, but it's been shown that assistive arm pedaling is beneficial and maintains ability. Doing stretches, hydrotherapy, taking them swimming on a regular basis. Stretches, as I've said, maybe use of a standing frame. Not that many like standing frames, but they are beneficial. So I think the more you can do, but make it into smaller segments and try and mix it up. So 10 to 15 minutes every day, rather than trying to do an hour and a half on one day, because no one's going to manage an hour and a half. But if you can just break it down into those little segments, 10 to 15 minutes on a daily basis, it takes ages to formulate a pattern and a habit of doing it. But once it is a habit, it becomes a daily routine, like getting up in the morning, getting dressed, having a bath, brushing teeth, all those sorts of things. It needs to be a habit.
And presumably building on Vivek's experience as a child, making it fun for children, I guess, is a key thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the element is always trying to make it meaningful, but physiotherapy isn't always fun, and stretching is not fun. But if you can add value to it, so to say that you can now do this because of this, if they can take away the value of doing it, then that makes some difference. If they feel better afterwards. And that's why I say, like, doing 10 to 15 minutes is better than trying to do it for too long. Sometimes there's a tendency to prescribe or give too many exercises. So you end up with these sheets of 5 pages of exercises, and people look at that and go, oh, well, I haven't got time to do all that. And I try and just limit it to like 4 or 5 that people can go, yeah, I can do that. It's reasonable. You got 5 pages, yeah, not reasonable.
And something Vivek sort of touched on right at the start of this section was how he's had to adjust his sort of communication with his sort of care and support around sort of COVID. I'd be really interested. Short plug, MDUK. We published a report at the start of summer called "Shining a Light," which looked at the experience of people living with muscle wasting conditions and on services. But I'd be really interested in hearing from you all about how you've had to adjust your service. And Jared, if I come to you first, I'm guessing sort of monitoring bone health is quite difficult on a Zoom call. So what kind of thing have you had to sort of bring in?
I mean, it's been quite difficult, and I suppose it comes back to some of the things that I said and in my talk about building evidence base for what we do, even in simple things like monitoring, like how often is necessary for the test. And I think a lot of what we do in pediatrics, and particularly in adults, as well as Ross said, is all a lot of the expert opinion. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but I think the pandemic has actually helped us sort of focus on some of the things that we do, and we probably realize that there are still certain things which is basically just based on expert opinion. It's not wrong, but maybe it's time for us to look a little bit more critically into evidence. It has been challenging getting some of the bone health monitoring, particularly I think in 2020 is much better these days. We do have some families who are still a little bit hesitant about lots more attendance to hospital. I think in an ideal world, we like a whole day where people come twice a year and everything can be done in a day. But in reality, that doesn't kind of happen. So I think these are some things that we've had to think more critically, basically. So in that regard, kind of thing, I just want a quick comment on echoing on the whole sort of like multidisciplinary setup. And I know, Francesco and Ross have talked about the whole sort of more in the neuromuscular setting, but I think Duchenne, particularly in older adolescents and adults, becoming much more complicated. I think really in all aspects of care, even in some of what I do, I think actually working very closely with different people is actually brilliant. And I've had the privilege of doing a multidisciplinary endocrine Duchenne clinic with my physiotherapist, and they're life-changing because you could have vertebral fractures, but then we know that, and have back pain, but we know that back pain is very common in DMD, and a lot of it is actually the underlying muscle condition, the positioning, the equipment, and of course, sometimes if those are not addressed by my excellent physiotherapy team, it can worsen the pain caused by vertebral fracture. So it's one of these things that I think we all have lots to contribute, which I think is why we're all here, and we're all helping each other really for the good of the patient.
Thanks, Jared. Roz, can I come to you next in terms of just how you adjusted your service?
Yeah, I have to say last year was the most challenging. Well, the last 18 months have been the most challenging time that we have ever had. The hospital developed what they call green and blue pathways. So a green pathway is for those people who would be at risk if they got COVID. So that means you could bring fewer people in. They have to isolate before they come in. They have to COVID test before they come in. All the staff have to COVID test on a regular basis, and patients and staff were wearing PPE. But by doing that, I think we kept a safe service, but the numbers of people we could bring in were very, very much reduced. But actually a big challenge for us as well was trying to get people to come in for their sleep studies and their echoes. We've actually now, I think, had about 10 adult patients under our care who caught COVID, and none of them became seriously ill. In fact, most of them had no symptoms at all, or only lost their sense of smell for a short time. And we had a few patients who had a very, low-grade fever for a short time. In fact, most of those patients were only found to have COVID because their other family members became ill with it and were sicker than them. But yet we still cannot get people to come in, and they've been vaccinated. And I can't emphasize enough, actually, it's more dangerous to your health to not have a sleep study and to not have a cardiac echo than it is probably for you to catch COVID, actually. And the people who are more at risk for COVID are the old people like us and parents and carers, but not the young adults that we see with Duchenne.
Thanks, Roz. Vivek, before I bring in Francesco, just interested to hear your experience as someone receiving care and support from a centre. Kind of what adjustments that you experienced actually were good, and would you'd like to see kind of happen in the longer term, and what would you like to see reinstated from sort of pre-COVID times?
Well, I think one of the things that has helped me a lot is kind of having phone calls from a neurologist sometimes, because like the neurologist sometimes I'm I'm all right, so a phone call is good, but kind of if I do feel ill, then I definitely kind of know that I can go to the hospital. Initially, I was like scared to go out, but I think I've slowly kind of come around to the fact. So I like the phone calls, but I also kind of, because you can't do tests over the phone. So, like I've gone to my respiratory and my heart appointments, and I've had like checks done on that, and it's all right. So kind of, I think, but both ways are helpful, because for me, traveling is quite a long. It's quite tiring. So yeah. So yeah, but I think both of them, I feel a lot more in control of my care in this way.
That's interesting. And Francesco, sort of building on that, but also what in terms of the service at Queen Square, what sort of changes did you make? Have you made it GOSH, and how have sort of families responded to being able to contact you virtually and stay in touch with their care?
Well, I think that as everybody, we now run. Well, we used to run the Zoom clinic and so on, and there is a role for that. And as also Jaro was probably mentioning before, you realize that not 100% of what we had to do face-to-face need to be done face-to-face, and there are some things that can be done by Zoom. At the same time, now for a number of months, our clinic are working essentially 100%. I think that there is still a little of delay in how we monitor respiratory function tests, and because these are aerosol generating procedure, before we used to do them in clinic, and that was so 100% of our patients will have the functional test. Now, I think this is a restricted number of people in whom you have a higher level of suspicion. So I think I think is a little of a step back, because in a way the longitudinal monitoring allowed to collect more information and probably troubleshoot things before. I think now we need to be extra careful to make sure that the patient are referred. We cannot refer every single patient to have a sleep study and so on. So that, I think, is hopefully that will change and will go back to what it was, because I think that is a slightly retrograde step. I think that the other thing, coming back to, however, new opportunities, there are ways that hopefully now that the national insurance tax has been raised and there will be a lot more money for the NHS, I think that there are ways that we could take the best of both worlds. For example, there are ways to monitor respiratory function and do quite good quality sleep study at home, but it requires a particular piece of machinery that is a bit expensive. So working, and at the moment we have tried to identify a source of funding for that, but it's not immediate. So I think if in a way it would not take a Nobel Prize of Medicine to start thinking that if you were able to offload hospital admission and regular sleep study in hospital with also a program that can be done at home, so you can troubleshoot and you only bring in hospital the patient where there is a problem, because in reality many of our sleep study are still normal. So we like it when it's normal, but I think that could have been perhaps done at home. But I think that the type of sleep study that we now consider to be reliable require medium-sized specialized equipment. They're not completely simple. So I think that I suppose there is now work to do to try to bring something out from the hospital into people's home and hospital. I'm using overnight sleep study as one example, but I think that there are opportunities. I think we need to ensure that we use the opportunities. We also need source of funding though to use this opportunity.
Thank you. Nick, we've had a question that's a bit sort of more specific about physio, I think, although others may want to come in, which is around a boy with Duchenne having frequent falls and finding it difficult getting back up from the floor. So the question is, rather than resorting to hoisting, are there any alternative manoeuvres or aids that can help children to be as independent as possible?
It's a really tricky one, because are they at the point where they shouldn't be walking? And that's a really difficult question to ask, and it's also a very different question to answer. If they're falling frequently, are they putting themselves at risk of fracture? I'd argue yes. If they do fracture, then that puts them at risk of further complication. If they're falling daily and 2 or 3 times a day, I would say that in that case they shouldn't really be walking, unless they are just walking around the home with assistance, and it's in a very, very safe environment. If they're outside, then I would say they need to be in a wheelchair. There's a manga cushion, there's something called a manga cushion, which you should be able to access through social services or OT, which can help get people who have fallen back up to standing rather than hoisting. And they're really, really good. They're quite expensive, but as I say, you should be able to get that through social services. I would be at that point if they come to me in clinic and said, so-and-so's falling several times a day, really struggles to get up. I would have that difficult conversation with the parents. And sometimes what I've found is that once the boy or young adult goes into a wheelchair, their life suddenly changes and it opens up lots of opportunities to them rather than takes things away. They're able to go out with their friends, they're able to keep up with their friends, their fear goes away, they can concentrate on more practical things, they can do more, save some energy. So all those sorts of things play into a positive side of not walking. Walking's always seen as being this gold standard, this thing we really want to preserve. It's important, but it's not the end of the world if it goes away, unfortunately. You know, the harsh reality, that's why sometimes the truth is difficult to take, but sometimes it's better to tell the truth than try and wash over it.
Thanks, Nick. Another question we had in advance, which I think is this one is going to be for Ros, Francesco, or Jared, or all three. It's a question around a family who've had a son recently diagnosed with Duchenne, and they're wondering about carrier testing for their daughter. What is there advice for families around that, and kind of what kind of process and age people might look at doing that?
Do you want me to answer that? I think normally we would recommend it's done when that daughter is able to understand the rationale for the testing. And so that depends on not just age, but state of maturity. So that could be anything from 14 years of age to 18 years of age. You know, it really depends on the maturity of the girl, but we wouldn't recommend testing a young girl if they didn't understand why they were being tested, so that they can actually understand the purpose of it and also give consent as well.
Thank you. Francesco and Jared, if you're going to add to that, that sounded like a comprehensive response.
No, well, I think in actual fact, there are guidelines, that is what Ros was referring to, that will not allow you, unless there is a particular reason, to test somebody who is 5 years old. And so it's not that, it's almost out of our hand, but for a good reason. That is exactly what Ros has explained. Perhaps just to buffer or to dampen any anxiety people could have, there is no health issue for a possible carrier in a pediatric age range. So it's not that there is any disadvantage for that, young person not to know and that you would do anything differently from a medical perspective. So I think that is what also, it would be different if there was the anticipation of a condition that would affect, you have a child of 5, I make an example, and then another sibling is 2, and the child may have not yet symptoms, but we know that if the child was affected, in a few years' time, he or she would develop the disease. That's quite a different story. But for the carrier, I completely agree with what Ross mentioned.
Great, thank you. We've got a few minutes left, but I'll stop wrapping up soon. But I'm going to give Vivek sort of the final word, unless more questions come in. Which is, Vivek, really interesting. Kind of, you mentioned how you've kept doing the things you love and staying connected, and that being a bit of a challenge in COVID. But I know that before COVID, you did things like set up a local group and it been involved in the local community. One of the questions that came in advance of the session was around a sense that someone was becoming isolated from their community. Kind of what things did you do and are doing to sort of help remain engaged?
Well, the thing is, like, before I was kind of slowly being disconnected because I had issues using my computer. I couldn't use it, so I had to kind of find a new setup, and it took me a long time to kind of set it up. So I think to answer that question, I had to be a lot more thinking about how to look after myself with solutions. So when I was isolated, I tried to go on the computer thing. Kind of, I slowly managed to kind of start up doing kind of through MDUK. I started I worked with Microsoft with the Xbox Adaptive Controller. So in a way, that kind of helped me to push me to be kind of to try a bit more because I had the opportunity. But I think if you isolate it, is kind of it is good to know that there is help out there. That you can call upon a lot of people to kind of assist you. That if you're struggling with gaming, you can go to the gaming charity Special Effects, and they've helped me to kind of come up with ideas, and they helped me set me up so I could continue gaming. Because about 4 years ago, I thought not only I couldn't play games at all, so I thought the only option was for me was just to give up. But then afterwards, I realized how important kind of gaming was in my life, and that kind of helped me to push me to find out about accessibility. And then through that, I've managed to like talk at gaming conferences. I do a lot with game developers, so it was kind of one little transite from MDUK kind of pushed me to take more steps, and then I become quite kind of attached to reality now through my computer. And even though majority of the time I'm at home on my computer, I still feel connected because I have still got a lot of things that I can do, like my mind's occupied, rather than like feeling lonely, which I've experienced that a lot when I was younger. So yeah.
Thanks, Vivek. It was classic error to say the last question, because as I said that, more popped up. We've got a little bit more time left. So there's a question around manifesting carriers and information that can be shared with families to take to GPs. I wonder if I don't know who's best placed, but perhaps a quick definition of what we mean by manifesting carrier, and then yeah, any sort of recommended sources of information. Ros, you came off mute, which was a signal I'm going to take that you can start with this.
Well, actually, that's where do you begin? I mean, how you define a manifesting carrier? So actually, we are having an NMC workshop on manifesting carriers, which will take place next year. And in fact, it's Anna Sarkozy, who's Francesco's colleague, who's leading on this, with a hope to try and define things further. I know that MDUK's got some information on their website, haven't you, for manifesting carriers? I think I wouldn't want to say much more than that, really. I think there's more research needed really into carriers and manifesting carriers and their health issues, but certainly all carriers should, over the age of 16 have a heart scan on a regular basis. That would be my big advice for carriers of Duchenne. I don't know if Francesco wants to add to that.
No, I think that I may have triggered that that question when I mentioned the fact that unless the person or the young lady in a family or child has no symptoms, then treatment should not be warranted. And from that perspective, the risk of somebody or a girl who is 10 to develop unexpected problem within pediatric age range is essentially zero. Now, is slightly different for people who have weakness and difficulties, and occasionally some carriers, some females may experience significant weakness in pediatrics. Rose was mentioning about the cumulative lifelong risk of developing some problems, such as, for example, heart problem that is higher in the DMD carriers compared to the general population. And indeed, there are standard of care recommendations regarding the fact that from 16 onwards, it makes sense to have a frequent, not every year, but heart scan, just to demonstrate that the heart is normal. So there are standard of care guidelines, but I think that as I do not see many young adults with the condition, I will need to check myself which is the type of information. And the MDUK may have already something, but certainly the standard of care recommendation exists in terms of the frequency of cardiac surveillance for people who are carriers of DMD.
Thanks, Francesco. I'm going to end the session there. Actually, it's been a fascinating 2 hours. So thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to all attendees who've taken part and fed in questions. Francesco, I hope we've given you 11 minutes back to finish your slides for your 3 o'clock meeting. So good luck with that. Very good, excellent. A huge thank you to the panel. Thanks again to our sponsors this afternoon. It really helps us to be able to continue these sessions going. A reminder as well that we'll put this video up on our website over the next few days, where you can also find all previous sessions and ones that we've got coming up. We've got quite a packed schedule between now and Christmas that you can sort of see on the website, including ones on education and employment, I think. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and do keep in touch with us via the helpline if you need any support or advice following this session. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.